Welcome to our fourth lecture on Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species. Today we're going to finally delve directly into the contents and arguments of the first four crucial chapters of The Origin of Species, where Darwin lays out his key insights into the significance of the variability of living things and the role of selection in generating complexity. Before we jump into our discussion of variation, we just point to the two images on the first screen in front of you here. The first is, as it says, the Beagle anchored at Tierra del Fuego, painted by Conrad Martins. Martins was the draftsman who accompanied the expedition. And then the Darwin Rhea, also known as the Lesser Rhea now, a bird first sampled and described by Darwin. And it seems to have played a crucial role in Darwin's evolution towards a theory of evolution, because this quite distinct species of flightless bird actually overlaps in its range with the other species that belongs to the same genus, a larger flightless bird. And Darwin, in his notebook, struggles mightily to try to make sense of why you would have two species, similar but clearly not the same, occupying the same range. This is a puzzle if we take it as given that the two species must have been created to fit some particular range. What's going on when they overlap with each other? Why are there two? Why not one of them? Whichever one works better. And this then leads Darwin to this crucial insight that perhaps there really isn't any such thing as a species. There are merely well-marked varieties. And he does. He takes it, as we all should, as a basic piece of background knowledge that plants and animals, as we find them in the world, exist in relatively well-defined populations. They're similar to each other in their structure and biology, in their behavior, and they tend to occur in compact, contained geographical ranges. What Darwin has started to worry about, though, is what does that mean, right? What should we take from that fact? And what he does, and why the first two chapters of The Origin of Species are so important, is he's going to turn this insight on its head, right? Rather than asking the traditional question. The traditional question is, okay, species are a real thing that every organism is produced so that it belongs to a particular species. The question, the thing that needs to be explained, then becomes, why are they different from each other, right? Why is it that within a species, no two organisms are exactly the same, right? They're only similar. They're not identical. Darwin turns this on its head and says, let's not ask that question. Let's start with variation. Let's start with the fact that almost no two organisms are perfectly identical. right? We have the occasional exceptions, right? In particular, right, the role of identical twins among humans, and there are similar phenomena in other species. But as a general rule, I don't have any trouble telling any two human beings apart. However, they are similar to each other. That is, I am more like my sister than I am like an oak tree, to reach back to the example from a few lectures ago. And I'm more similar to the other members of my family than I am to all of you, taken individually, right? I'm more similar to, or at least more likely to be similar to, my parents, and you're more similar to your parents than if I just sort of randomly picked even another human being out of the world. So, traits are inheritable, and the differences are sometimes inheritable. That is, we have these sort of traceable lines of inheritance that we can take advantage of. Now, what does that get us? Okay, right? This is Darwin's fundamental claim, right? And the first thing he needs to do is convince his readers that this variation is the most basic fact. The variation is not the accident. The similarity is what needs to be explained. The variation is the basic fact from which we begin. And he asks us to consider variation under domestication. That is, here's where he really pays off his attention to various forms of animal husbandry and plant breeding. Right? And he points out that it's the norm among our best known samples. Right? We don't have any trouble telling the difference between the puppies from a same litter. Right? Nor do we have any trouble improving our domestic fruits, right? So these are all the varieties of pear, and they're all descended within historical record from a single species of pear. As we can tell exactly how we got from the original wild pears to these radical variation in domestic pears. And he also wants to point out to us just how powerful this is, right? I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, we've got different kinds of pears, but they all pretty much look like pears, right? This is why he wants to pay so much attention to pigeons, okay? He wants to argue for the relationship between domestic pigeons and wild pigeons, and then to emphasize the radical variability that occurs with domestic pigeons from their wild species, their wild relatives. So I'm going to ask you now to just pause this video for a few minutes and go and look at the YouTube video that is linked just below this video on the page. And take a look at the behavior of these unusual pigeons. Okay, you're back. I hope you enjoyed the pigeons. It's a neat video. And just to point out then, right, it actually, one of the things Darwin needs to do is to point out that this kind of variability is, again, the norm even among wild species. It was actually Many people before Darwin believed that it was the unusual variability of domestic animals that was one of the characteristics of domestication. Right? It was one of the things that made them special. So he needs to argue that it's equally characteristic of our wild species. So this is actually a sample. The picture here is a collection of part of Alfred Russel Wallace's collection of Lepidoptera that he collected in the Pacific. And Darwin then goes from considerations of that to plants, right? One of the things Darwin really wants us to notice is that variation is really much more common, extreme variation in less complex organisms, right? So by the time you get to mammals, you have this problem. Almost everything fits together, right? There's very little in the way of variation that can show up in mammals that will not be fatal. And so you have these sort of strong boundaries, and that can fool us into thinking that's the characteristic, that the existence of these sort of strict boundaries is the characteristic state of things in the living world, right? Whereas Darwin, with his work in botany and his work on barnacles, comes to realize that that's much, much trickier with simpler animals, right? One of the things he realizes is this fact that, as a general rule, larger genera, so that the more different species there are within a given genus, the more different the species within the genus are, and the more variable the organisms are even within a given species within the genus. And so these are some of the wide variety of barnacle shells that Darwin collected in the work that was part of how he won the Royal Medal in 1853. And so a big part of what Darwin wants to do here is remind us not to confuse the big and the familiar with the important. Right? One way to think about this is, yes, mammals, fish, birds, right? Vertebrates of various kinds, right? And especially tetrapods, right? Birds, reptiles, human beings, right, mammals, are really familiar, and they sort of grab our attention because they're important in our environment, and they're not sort of so common, right? They come and go. Maybe one way to think about it is we pay attention to them because they're not always there, but most of the biomass, right, most of the living things on Earth measured by mass are plants and invertebrates of various kinds. And so, right, what we need to do is to look at those things, figure out how that would. We want to understand how biology works, how living things function. Start with that stuff and then worry about the exceptions later. And that's part of what Darwin is trying to get his readers to pay attention to. Okay. So we have variation. Darwin then brings into the mix an additional insight. So this is actually an insight that he pulls over from economics. Thomas Malthus writes the famous essay on the principle of population that is published in 1798. And it's Malthus who first points out in economic terms a particular problem, which is that resources expand arithmetically, but populations expand geometrically. What does that mean? Basically, that the amount of new land that you can bring into production does not depend on how much land you already have in production, right? So if you have 10 people, right, you can plant 10 acres, random number. If I have 11 people, I can plant 11 acres, right? If I have 12 people, I can plant 12 acres, right? The increase doesn't go up with the resource base. But that's not how population works, right? The size of the next generation depends on the size of the previous generation. So you get this doubling phenomenon, this exponential growth phenomenon that, in fact, right now, as I'm recording this lecture, we're all familiar with as we see this happening with the coronavirus pandemic and the increase in cases. Now, it actually turns out, Malthus actually thinks this is a crucial political insight. It turns out he's wrong about this, as far as we can tell, for human beings. He's writing this about humans. Malthus predicts from this that essentially famine is unavoidable in human societies, just as we break out of what is now called the Malthusian trap. But it does apply more generally. And so to achieve a stable population, only two things are going to do that. You have to reduce the rate of reproduction to match the available resources, or something has to happen to cause a die-off among the excess. That is, excess in the sense that there are more organisms, there's a higher rate of reproduction than the environment can support. That's Malthus. And that is, again, this struggle for existence is just a fact of any situation where the natural rate of reproduction outstrips the available resources. What's interesting and what Darwin is able to see is that this, when you combine the struggle for existence with variation, something really interesting happens. As long as the available variations affect the struggle for existence. So if I have two organisms, and those two organisms are different from each other in a way that their offspring inherit, and one or more of the ways in which they differ from each other gives the other one an advantage, makes it more likely that their offspring will survive. That's what generates natural selection. Right? Right, what's happening for Darwin is nature is acting the way a breeder does with domestic animals. It is, in a sense, picking and choosing which traits to pass on to the next generation. Now, This is complicated, right? And there's a reason why Darwin plays terminological games, right? It's not God. It's just a natural fact that this happens as long as the conditions are met. So what are those conditions, right? Struggle for existence, and the variations have to affect one of the following three outcomes. They have to improve an organism's chances to survive to sexual maturity. That is, improve the odds that a given organism will reproduce, increase the chances of successful reproduction or the success of their offspring, or play a role in sexual selection. Darwin makes this a separate constraint. It's really a version of the second one, but it's so important it's worth separating out. This is the fact that most organisms require two to tango. It requires two organisms from different branches of the same similar family tree to cooperate in order to generate descendants. And that selection, right? With whom will a given organism choose to cooperate in order to produce offspring affects outcomes. So we say that nature selects for a trait if and only if organisms that possess that trait have on average more offspring than the average for the whole population. Technically, it's in fact viable offspring. It really depends more on second generation descendants. It's not just enough to just have offspring. Those offspring have to have offspring. So if you had a horse that for some strange reason only produced offsprings with a donkey, then that horse will have lots of offspring, but it will not pass on its traits into the general population because its offspring are all sterile. So this is Darwin's machinery: variation, natural selection. How then does this combination generate the complex world that we see around us?